A surveyor's measurements continue to warp. A plane vanishes without a trace. An old woman tries to ignore the death downstairs until it gets desperate. Welcome to Hidden Oaks. And that was that, I thought. Packing up my instruments and closing my notebook felt no different than any other job in the moment. It was the home stretch I'd pulled into 1,000 times. Well, I thought about that too. It must have been literally close to 1,000. I was going to do the math later, but at that moment I still had that clear sense of a project wrapping up. The anxiety that comes with field work was over, and what remained was the payoff: drafting. The soothing ritual of rendering all the measurements into a map. I remember so vividly when as a child I first saw a globe. It was mesmerizing. I loved the patterns, the grid of thin, sharp lines marking latitude and longitude, the sizes of the letters spelling out place names, how no two touching regions were filled with the same color. Then in a moment I'll never forget, I traced with my index fingers the eastern coast of the Americas and the western coasts of Europe and Africa. This felt like a pattern too. Somehow, these locations literally separated by an ocean felt connected. My father smiled and started talking to me about tectonic plates and taught me the word Pangea. It was a treasured reward, and I never stopped loving the contours, the shapes, or the words of this planet's vast but entirely finite surface. I was lucky to have got the job where and when I did. Physically drafting on paper was not just soothing. It's important, it's real, and it's more correct than the mathematically graphed curves computers draw. Surveying land is one of civilization's oldest and most important jobs, and I got to do it the real way, without an assembly line. I'd see the entire process through. I'm sure splitting into just field work and just drafting is more efficient and more profitable, but you can't see the whole picture that way. And if you're not seeing the forest for the trees, what's the point? About halfway through drawing, it became clear I'd messed something up. Not the first time I'd made a mistake, of course. With most errors, I could leave myself some room and move on. Find the next anchor and keep working. I could always touch up later after taking some new measurements. It never felt as clean to end a job that way, and at first I thought that's all it was. But the more I tried to move on, the more wrong it became. The distances were off. Unreasonably off. I didn't make mistakes on this order of magnitude, did I? The whole map, even the parts I thought were correct, I couldn't trust any of it. There was just no way. I checked every instrument I'd used that day. If it could be calibrated, I did so. If it used batteries, I gave it new ones. In the process, I learned how long my neighbor's fence was, the height of every tree in my backyard, and that my garage floor wasn't remotely flat. I wished I hadn't found out that last one. That was going to bother me. Errors of any kind really upset me when I was younger, and I forget who or where I even heard this from, but what really helped me cope was the truth that every mistake produces one more chance for a double solution. The best solutions to any kind of problem are the ones that solve two or more problems at once, and little in life is more satisfying than that. Maybe a measurement was off because I'd taken it from an awkward point, taking it from where the light was better, or the ground was firmer, or the wind was sheltered would be easier. Give a more accurate result and fill in just a bit more of that big picture. I spent the next day checking and rechecking my readings. Everything near the streets was right, which was impossible. The further inside I went, the more impossible it became. Readings were correct if I sighted the same way as the day before, but if I measured the exact same angle or distance from anywhere else, the numbers were different. At one point, I was convinced I had made 5 right-angle turns from north before ending up pointing north again. How was I going to explain this to my foreman? I'd screwed up before, but never been stuck like this. Never had to repeat an entire day's work only to end up with a less complete survey than when I started. I put it off as long as I could, hoping to find a problem with my tools or realize a mistake I'd been compounding, or I don't know, wake up from a nightmare. But it never happened. I was doing the same work again and again and getting different results. Eventually, I was called in to go over the survey and get it filed. I've never been more humiliated. Trying to explain the 3 impossible and different maps I'd drawn, plus another I'd started which I knew full well was also impossible. Even worse was the pile of oh-so-diligent supporting material. Complete meticulous grids of mortifying, nonsensical gibberish. Nothing is ever perfect, of course, which is something she usually had no trouble saying. Even Plato's perfect mathematical world of pure forms, she sometimes continued, was fouled up by Aristotle, who decided to use the whole concept as an excuse for a human pecking order, the worthy few at the top and the layers of discrimination for everybody else. But I was neither working on a grand philosophy nor twisting anyone's ideas to justify injustice. What I had set on her desk was a rank, unintelligible eyesore. She said nothing for what felt like minutes. We both stared at my charts and my data, exposed and ridiculous. I thought I couldn't feel any more shame when she told me to take the rest of the week off. There was a rumor that the builder was pulling out, and we had some time. It should have been a welcome wave of relief, but I only felt worse. My head was spinning. My brain was on autopilot. I don't remember whether I said anything. I crumpled up my so-called work and drove a company truck home. I was still clutching the oversized wad of paper when I walked in. I threw it all down on the table with an overwhelmingly underwhelming plop. The grid lines were no longer a grid. The features of the park were reduced to jumbles. There sat my days of effort, somehow just a bit less worthless now that they were actually trash. The failure didn't look quite as final when it was scrambled up beyond recognition. I found myself punching at the mass of paper, turning it around in my hands, clapping stray edges down into a ball. With my index fingers, I began to trace some non-patterns which had mockingly begun to resemble each other. I knew I should let it go. Maybe the whole project was moot, but maybe I could still figure it out anyway, just for me. For that kid inside who was so delighted when the squiggles and the chaos coalesced into outlines and harmony. I took those days off, all right. I took them and continued right on working. On into the nights, all through the weekend I kept working. This infuriating little park was not going to defeat me. It exists. Hundreds of people walk by and through it every day, taking human-sized steps, and if I had to cover every bit of the land and swim every bit of the water myself, I was going to get the damned place mapped. I normally scan north to south when I can, but this was not a time for being normal. I tried everything. I moved in every order I could think to move in. I named and marked and sketched some of the more distinctive trees, 2 of which I have never seen since. I made an entire pass using no instruments at all, just eyeballing directly onto a map. It was all garbage. None of it made sense. The whole point of my work was to end up with a detailed record of what's out there, a clear and dependable graph on a page. Something accurate which people could use to make informed decisions. My own decisions started getting sloppy. My mind was everywhere except on what I was doing. I thought of high school, learning about the development of the periodic table. I never liked how or why its D block, where the transition metals are described, is ordered and continuous, but also interrupted after the first group by the F block. The lanthanides and the actinides belong there, but they mess up the group sequence. We usually put them in their own mini-table below, but they're not separate. It's a limitation of the grid structure, which otherwise works so cleanly. I think it was sometime during those off days that I started noticing a dark sedan stopped just outside the park. I only noticed because I thought I was halfway between roads, but there it was, 28th Avenue, close enough to see two Secret Service-looking guys sitting in a car, staring at me. I didn't know what to make of it at the time, and even now those weirdo Men in Black wannabes are the least of my worries. After so many drawings, so many measurements, so much time spent in the park, I should have been able to draw it by memory. The funny thing was, as angry as the entire debacle was making me, there were times I felt truly peaceful. On one hand, there was a comforting sense of insulation. On the other, I would feel linked, connected with the plants and the ground and the birds. Noisy traffic was 1,000 miles away, and as I would breathe, it felt like the woods were breathing with me. My own thoughts always had a habit of echoing and getting stuck, running in circles. And something about this place was making things both better and worse. I would have such calm and clear moments, such tranquility. I could sense the wind, but it would pass right by my clothes, my flesh, my bones, like neutrino particles passing harmlessly through the entire planet. Then I'd look down at more pages than I'd remembered filling, more impossible figures than I'd thought I'd recorded, more evidence that I was either losing my mind or had already done so. Eventually, it became too much. I couldn't take it anymore. It hurt. I hurt. I screamed. I hadn't screamed since I was a child, but I screamed then, into the woods, at the woods. It wasn't fair. A plot of land had no business outsmarting a person whose daydreams sounded like an earth sciences classroom. I could hear laughter. There must have been kids nearby, enjoying the lunatics shouting into the nice little park, but it felt for all the world like the park was the one laughing at me. I yelled harder, shouted until my throat hurt. Trees aren't supposed to play mind games and certainly not win them. The park didn't make sense, and my rage didn't make for the most coherent sentences, but I yelled and yelled, screamed until it started feeling wrong. Besides the pain, it felt like somehow I'd been yelling at a friend. I was beaten, and I knew it. It was time to give up. The Monday morning sun had come up, and I hadn't slept in days. Maybe my foreman would give me another day off, or maybe she'd fire me, or send me on to another project. I honestly didn't care anymore. I just never wanted to see this apparently non-Euclidean patch of woods and water and quiet and bugs and peace and hell ever again. As I turned to leave, it was as if I'd never seen any of my surroundings before in my life. I couldn't tell which way I had just been walking. I wasn't even sure what direction the sunlight was coming from. I couldn't possibly be so lost. This was a small park. My sense of direction and my own internal logic had been beaten too. I had given up, and now had to somehow give up even further and just start walking straight in an arbitrary direction. I can't tell you how demoralizing it felt to do something arbitrary right then. Having no logical reason to choose a direction, but having to do it anyway, it was torture. Humanity's a funny thing. Did my primate ancestors ever find such a small bit of woods so defeating? Was evolution about to weed out this obviously unfit surveyor? I felt like I could remember millions of years ago, before words like Minnesota or oak had ever been spoken. I felt like time stretched out before me infinitely, and like I had already wrapped all the way back around to my own moment. I was still nowhere I knew, still hoarse, still angry, and now afraid I could no longer be trusted even to walk in a straight line. I threw down my pack and flung it open, spilling its contents like a child throwing a tantrum. My notebooks, my instruments, all of it had to come out. I couldn't carry it anymore. It had to be dumped out, all of it. Right then I heard something. Or I was so tired that I hallucinated hearing something. A sort of sound I hadn't ever heard before and haven't been able to describe. Not an echo exactly, but it had a quality as though it had come a great distance and had lost all semblance of whatever made it into a sound in the first place. But the sound didn't matter. Now that my pack was empty and tossed away, a bright bundle was in my hands. Pin flags. I was walking and planting them one after another. I don't remember even thinking, but the plan was obvious. I'd mark my way forward and be able to verify empirically that I was making progress. I had de-evolved into a fairy tale character leaving breadcrumbs. I still felt dizzy and was as tired as I can ever remember being, but ahead I went. I used up all the yellow flags first, then the red, then the green. When I had only the white flags left, my back hurt so badly as I bent down to plant one that I collapsed, dropping the flags and hitting the ground hard. Not with a thud, not with a slap of my hand catching a nearby stump, not with the grunt I certainly made, not with the lightest flutter of nylon squares falling through the air. In a tiny instant that felt like a stretched-out drama, I realized that I hadn't become a fairy tale. I was a philosophical thought experiment. Where was Plato now? I had literally fallen in a forest and not made a sound. Balance, distances to nearby surfaces, hints about texture and hardness and motion. Sound gives us so many cues. When it's absent, when it's just gone, nothing makes sense. Nothing seems real. The idea of zero sound seems unreal itself. I kept finding new heights of disorientation. Why was any of this happening? What was I doing wrong? But no. Those were the kind of questions and thoughts that would often trap my brain, but right then, in the silence, my mind was silent too. I rolled my head and collected myself, and for what I realized was the first time, looked back at my trail of flags. Whether I was able to make noise or not, I was speechless. They were lined up all right, as straight as I could have asked for, and stretched as far back as could be seen. The trail was also crisscrossed, hashed, intersected with itself. But what that dotted pattern of flags was telling me, I found I already knew. So I followed the trail of white flags on ahead to where I had left my things. I gathered all my gear and papers back into my pack and lifted my head. Then, I did what I'd been trying and failing to do all day, just like that. I left Hidden Oaks. By the time my foreman came to my house, I was ready. It wasn't complete, but it was finally correct. My survey was built. No, it had arisen from my previous incomplete attempts. Cuts needed to be made, creating snaking ribbons of topography. Addendums had to be taped in, folds and curvature had to be added. Hidden Oaks had its own lanthanide and actinide trails, its own parallel Atlantic coasts. Its area looked small on a flat map, but flatness lies to us. I was very excited about all this, and excited to get back to work to finish the survey and file the most spectacular chart I'd ever made. She didn't share my enthusiasm. The builder was ducking out. The company was going to have to sue or settle to even get paid. She said some other things too about how I was lucky I wasn't in jail and why hadn't I returned company property for however many days, something about years of work. I'm pretty sure I was fired, but the real damage had been done. The point was, she didn't see my survey, didn't really truly see it. I had to use different scale factors. I had to use the floor since my table wasn't big enough. The compasses and the legends had the required fifth point, O for other, poking out on toothpicks. Was all that distracting from the substance? Couldn't she see the forest for the trees? The parts that curled under and over each other, the freestanding mesh of trails joined by staples and glue, the regions folded in on themselves like origami. Could all of that have gone over her head? I was so proud, so in love with what I'd mapped, but I had failed to share it. I couldn't turn my thoughts, my knowledge into the right set of shapes and words to survive the journey into another person's mind, not even someone as smart as she was. She was bright, after all, brighter than me. I knew that. Could have had a prestigious job at a university, for sure, but she was like me. She enjoyed the contours, the shorelines, the places so many people never see. The tradition and the ritual of an individual expert surveyor doing the work from beginning to end, if anyone should be able to understand, surely. No. What was sure was that the fault was on my end. I hadn't explained correctly, or I'd made the wrong comparisons. The park isn't a periodic table, and it isn't a tectonic split shoreline. I was like a caveman trying to describe the space shuttle as a stone bird breathing upside-down fire. So I kept working. Days, Weeks after she left, I didn't need the company truck or the equipment. I had everything I needed to continue the project. Every time I came back, I had new layers, new details, new connections. My survey was getting more and more complete. I finally started to feel like I was reaching the home stretch again. The impending satisfaction of wrapping up a job. I'd had to take steps out of order, but at some point I knew that I would connect all the lines. One evening I got home and couldn't open the door. The letter taped up was an eviction notice, which I suppose made sense. People have their own ideas about how things are supposed to be. We don't always agree, but we have to try to understand. I try to understand, anyway. Seems a bit one-sided sometimes. Not one person has asked me how things are supposed to be. Nobody would talk to me about the park at all. No, that's not so. One person did say something, only he was that black sedan mystery man. And it was the same day I had kicked in a window to recover my survey and the rest of my materials. Once I had everything packed up, I was ready to stay in Hidden Oaks. Walking there somehow felt quicker than driving, but space and time outside the park are kind of strange if you ask me. As I approached the park again, that sunglasses-wearing X-Files guy showed up and tried to shoo me away. Me! You'd think a person like that would recognize authority. Nobody was more of an expert on Hidden Oaks. This was my home. It's always been my home, my Pangea. But he had other ideas. When I refused to leave, he started to chase me. I didn't know what he wanted, and I didn't want to find out. Fast. He was so fast and in shape. I suppose I wasn't as strong as I had been. Not that I was ever too strong to begin with. But I was spent, winded. I thought he was going to get me for sure. I almost tripped, and then I saw it. One of my pin flags. Of course. I'd been reacting, running aimlessly like a tourist. What was I thinking? I turned, ducked into the yellow Mobius path, and quickly turned again near Trina Maple. I watched him go by, watched him slow down, watched the confusion spread over his amateur face. Agent Smith indeed. He didn't know. He couldn't see. And that was that, as they say. I realized this was where I was supposed to be, how I was supposed to be. The park was teaching me how to see. I was learning how, learning why. I was a child mesmerized by a new globe, connecting, developing. I wasn't just learning new information either, but learning how to learn. There weren't lectures or books or notes. I had only my own senses and actions. In that regard, I felt somehow stifled, like I was studying the globe while wearing mittens. But slowly, inhibited or not, I was, and I am, figuring things out and training in an altogether new kind of knowledge. One thing I did learn pretty quickly is that the others weren't of any real consequence. Secret Agent Man and his partner soon came stalking after me again, but the best solutions solved multiple problems. When they ambushed where I wasn't, they found only my clothes. They left with a poor consolation prize. I was rid of them, and best of all, I had shed those useless mittens. The body needs to touch a place like this to be part of it, just as a draft is only real if you walked the land, made the measurements, and drew the lines. Speaking of, I do still have my survey. I think I'll keep it, now that it's truthful. Nobody sees it, even if I show them, but that's fine. I'd rather spend my time learning anyway. I watch the birds and insects to learn what they instinctively know. I study the wind and learn to share its paths without sharing the cold. I observe the changes, the pulses, the cycles of my home. I listen to life, and just for fun, there are always the others to listen to. I hear their funny little stories. My favorite is the one about the land surveyor who got lost in the woods, or got hit on the head, or got possessed by a swamp monster. Got fired, got divorced, got committed, got turned into the crazy naked homeless person in the Hidden Oaks Park. I can't help but laugh. They might as well tell how the oceans became so small and dry, or why rain falls up, or describe the very woods they're walking through as flat and lifeless, invisible. It's all right. I don't expect anybody to understand. But I do. When the hushes meet, and the underbridge falls, I will see. I will be ready. The seconds ticked by, and Joel had no idea what to do. The whole situation had been so brief and so anticlimactic that he wasn't even sure that it had happened at all. If it had, however, the implications were quite dire indeed, and Joel knew it. The combination of those two truths is what was so paralyzing. Joel was a hardcore protocol guy. You had to be when you were working as an air traffic controller. He still did not have any way to explain what had happened, or, again, if it even did happen. He had nearly been falling asleep in the tower. These overnights were really getting hard on Joel. He had just done a few of those head bobs in a row when he saw the blip appear on his radar. Before the aircraft first reached out to him, requesting clearance to approach. Then, after he granted it, and the pilot acknowledged his instructions regarding an approach heading, the pilot mentioned, rather casually, that his Beechcraft's instruments had just started behaving strangely. When the plane was just over 5 miles straight south of the airport, it disappeared from the radar entirely. Joel tried several times to hail the pilot on the radio, and there was no answer. Only silence. Joel felt perplexed for a moment, then confused. There was no emergency mentioned. There were no other planes in the vicinity at all, and the pilot was at an elevation that would preclude the possibility of him striking any radio towers or power lines or anything of that nature. But when a plane left the radar and he lost communication with a pilot that was nearby, there were really only a few possible reasons, and none of them were good. Had he maybe dozed off more than he realized and just imagined the radio call? No. All he had to do was look down at his clipboard to know that. He had jotted down Beach 279er Kilo Romeo, the call sign of the aircraft. In the end, perplexing and maddening as all the situation was destined to be. Joel, following protocol, reported the lost plane to the authorities immediately, filed the appropriate forms, and raised the appropriate alarms. There was never any crash site determined. The plane and pilot were identified, however, though they weren't ever found. Earlier that day, Jerome Oliver took off from Kenosha Airport in eastern Wisconsin in his 1977 Beechcraft Bonanza. And as far as anyone could tell, he never landed, catastrophically or otherwise, and he was never heard from again. Despite there being a decomposing body in the guest bedroom of her 2-story split-entry home, Marjorie kept the rest of the house extremely clean. The hardwood floors were mopped, the curtains washed, the bathroom tiles scrubbed, and the windows wiped. It sometimes happened on an hourly occurrence. It wasn't just because of her husband's dead body sprawled across her son's old bed. Marjorie had always been a hygienic person, but with the various insects, fluids, and smells that echoed Walter's death, she felt like her obsessive-compulsive behavior was at least a little bit warranted. Marjorie didn't want her life to change when it did. When she woke up and turned to him to say good morning a year ago, nothing replied. He died in his sleep. She didn't know from what or how, but his blue eyes were fixed open at the ceiling like a fish on a cutting board. His skin was extra blue, the type that belongs in the sky. Her first reaction was to call everyone, 911, her son, the coroner. However, she didn't want them to tell her it was over. She'd had a good imagination. She could keep Walter alive inside of it. She could always be far away from whatever was near, no matter how sad it was. At first she thought she could leave his body in bed with her. She could just pretend he was sick and bring him tea, crackers, and tissues. The smell started quickly, though, a sour, fleshy aroma that seemed to stick to your own skin. He also voided his bowels, which oozed through the mattresses and onto the floor in a brown puddle. She didn't know a lot about decomposition when she started this whole project, but she did know that she had to keep him in one of the basement bedrooms where the various fluids could seep through the spare bedding and onto the floor. Marjorie was a little concerned that the neighborhood might start to notice the stench or strangeness of the situation. It was easy enough to hide Walter's death. Nobody was interested in him or her. They had one son, Greg, who lived in Arizona and would only call them a few times a year. He'd gotten a job down there after college and made it his home ever since. He had a wife, but no children. Marjorie thought this was an indictment of them, and she was right, though Greg would never tell her that directly in his lifetime. Marjorie always secretly hated how hard they were on their son. Walter would inspect him like a drill sergeant whenever he left the house. Teeth, hair, fingernails, clothes, all of it went under her dead husband's microscope. He always looked good, but despite being so well kept, Greg never grew up with much confidence. His wife had said once that he never felt good enough. Those words stuck with Marjorie. She didn't want to know why, but she did. After Walter's death, there were a few things she didn't have to worry about anymore. Urine on the bathroom floor was one thing, along with being able to spend money on whatever she wanted. She didn't have to worry about him critiquing her driving or how well she dusted or what she spent her time doing. There were countless fights when Greg was growing up about what kind of housework she'd do while he was working. Occasionally, he'd do a white glove test to areas of the kitchen. It made her feel sick when he'd do that. He stopped following one occurrence when she stopped speaking to him for months. Now, Walter was the silent one. There were times when she missed him. The kiss on the cheek from his dry lips when he left for work in the morning. The box of chocolates on Valentine's Day. The way he fearlessly smashed bugs with his slipper. Now, insects had the last laugh. If only Walter could see what kind of a palace his pale and withered body had become for them to play inside. The last few days had been a little strange to Marjorie. She knew something serious had happened in the neighborhood because an ambulance had made a visit to one of their neighbors up the street. He was an older man with 2 children grown and gone. She watched through her curtains as they loaded him into the back of the vehicle, blared the sirens, and shot down the road like an angry wasp. She'd never spoken to the man. He was far more of a hermit than her, which was saying something. His backyard was full of junk the few times she'd walked by his house. She remembered craning her short neck and adjusting her glasses so she could peer through the wooden fence. Rust, random shapes, and piles of miscellaneous equipment stared back at her. When they took her neighbor away on a stretcher, she planned her trip to the mailbox at the same time. She waddled out there without directly looking up the street. She was wearing navy blue sweatpants and a black sweatshirt with white sneakers. She rarely changed out of them, with the amount of cleaning she needed to do at home. Plus, she didn't want to stain any of her nice clothes with bleach and make them bleed. She nodded, feeling satisfied after they took him away with an oxygen mask tied around his face, like they were doing her a favor. She didn't know why. The slow walk back to her door between the rose bushes and lines of bricks seemed longer than usual. It was like the path of concrete squares beneath her feet were popping up, one after the other. It was like she was being led somewhere. There was a weird sour smell blowing around the summer air, like a pond that she'd never noticed had just taken a stinky breath. Sound seemed to be disjointed, distant. Sunlight had lost its edge. Then she was at her door. She opened it slowly just to get her bearings. Her house was quiet. She stared at the black metal rails that went upstairs and downstairs along white, carpeted steps. Downstairs was a dark hallway with 3 doors that led to a seldom used second family room. And there, just then, a brown door gently shut. Marjorie blinked her green eyes as if they might tell her something. Did she just see someone close that door? That was where Walter's body was stored. Marjorie sat down on the steps and tried to look at the mail. Early on, after he had died, she noticed little things like this happening. She thought it was just part of the grief process, and they eventually went away. This moment was the first where it seemed like something strange had actually happened in this reality. If she'd had a dog or a cat or anything else living in the house, they might have noticed it too. She could have a cat now that Walter was dead. He wouldn't let her have any pets before. They were too dirty, he said. Marjorie stayed perfectly still on the stairs. She thought if she didn't move that perhaps the sound would return and she'd actually hear it again. Maybe even surprise it like it was a person. There were no other sounds in the house. Just the hum of the central air, the grumble of the refrigerator, and the occasional metallic coo of the wind chimes hanging outside her patio door. She could hear her own breath and the ticking of the grandfather clock upstairs by the couch. "Okay, I really am just imagining things," she said, standing up and walking up the stairs. "No," a voice said from somewhere. It was withered and distant, like it was hidden behind 100 different walls. "Hello? Hello, is someone there?" Marjorie said. Nothing replied. "Okay, I'm really going nuts," she said, walking to the bathroom. Later that day, Marjorie had a hard time going anywhere in her house without stopping and listening. She still felt like someone was in the house with her, but there could be nobody else. She even popped her head into Walter's room, and sure enough, his dried, pale body was tucked beneath the blanket where she'd left it. She did notice the doorknob was a little wet, but that could have been the moisture in the room brewing from his decomposition. "I think I'm losing it," she said, as she closed the door on her husband's sour, dead body. For dinner that night, Marjorie warmed up a TV dinner and ate it on a metal tray in front of Wheel of Fortune. She liked the roast turkey with gravy, a bit of stuffing, and the styrofoam-like mashed potatoes. A few bites into her meal and she heard another click of the door downstairs. She froze, as if she wanted her imagination to catch up with her. There were a few quakes of weight traveling in the house on the stairs and walls. Something was moving downstairs. It had to be. Marjorie stood up, holding her plastic fork like a sword. She searched for words but could only say one thing. "Hello? Is someone there? How can I help you?" she said with a tremble. She shook her head. Why did she sound like a cashier at the grocery store? Nothing replied. Marjorie stood up and walked over to the top of the stairs. She leaned over them, craning her tiny body against the black rails that followed each step. She didn't want to look too closely at the pocket of darkness where the basement started. It was almost like it was alive, flowing, a piece of phantom water from some unnatural abyss. "Hello?" she said. There was a strange melody, like a song was playing somewhere in her house, but she couldn't hear it. The house seemed to stretch underneath her feet. She felt like she was standing on some sort of boat. The sensation reminded her of being on an outrigger canoe on their honeymoon in Hawaii. He was so adventurous then. He hadn't been ground down into routine working for the Ford plant in St. Paul. This memory seemed to settle Marjorie, and she steadied her legs. The house was back to normal. The temporary ocean had passed. The air smelled like evening light. The refrigerator buzzed lazily in the background. I think I'm ready for bed," Marjorie said. She threw away the rest of her dinner, turned off the television, wiped down the kitchen with some bleach, checked the carpet for crumbs, closed all the blinds, curtains, and windows. Then she crawled into bed. She listened for more sounds to echo up to her. She was hoping that the pink quilt wrapped around her body would act like some sort of fortress and make all the creepiness of the basement bounce off of her. It reminded her of being scared when she was little. She'd hide underneath the blankets with her sister when the wind would howl too loudly. For a while, Marjorie couldn't sleep. She just stared at the windows to the left of her queen-sized bed. The blinds were pulled down over them in plastic tongues. Bits of sunlight crawled in around the shadows. A memory flashed into her mind of putting her son to bed during the summer, when the evening light was still a yellow edge aching around the window box. He'd cry so much about not being able to play with his friends, but Walter wouldn't budge an inch on it. If only Greg knew that his father was dead, maybe that would bring him back here. There'd be no reason to stay away, even if she'd been complacent to it all. Walter scared her most when his routine was knocked off track. He was like a delicate train that couldn't handle a single gust of wind. There'd be bruised knuckles and bloody noses to pay if he had to pause his life. Greg probably dwelled on these moments the most. Maybe he'd be happy to know she'd kept his father prisoner on the other side of life. It made her happy knowing that, in the end, she had all the control. He couldn't outlive it. That night she had a strange and particularly vivid dream. She was in some sort of prairie out west. It looked like North or South Dakota, but she couldn't be sure. It had been years since Walter took her anywhere but Duluth to watch as the big ships came into the harbor in the summer. Wherever it was she was imagining, it was empty of all things. There were billowing fields of wild wheat, grass, and flower all around her. They were heaving violently like a tempest had been chained to the ground. The rippling winds didn't touch, graze, or dent her presence. The scene reminded her of a painting Walter had been working on not long before he died. He'd given it to a neighbor for some random reason. Marjorie couldn't completely feel her body, though. She could just feel an image of herself being projected into the scene. There was also a smell around her, too. It was earthy, sunken, like the pond water she'd smell when it rained too much and liquid would stand in pools between the blades of grass in her backyard. Why would it smell like such decay in such a vivid scene? Marjorie thought. Beyond the winds, wilderness, and the fields, the sun was exceptionally blinding. There were no clouds at all. The blue looked like a person standing over her. It filled in every empty detail in her vision. Except for one thing. Ahead of her, between the mounds of glowing yellow and green, was a bridge. It was curled over a stream like a bug. It was cobblestone with bits of moss on its dark base. Beneath it, where the water rushed by like it had no interest in whatever phantasm was blossoming, a shape was coming toward her. There was a sudden vacuum of air around her body in the direction of the shadow, pushing her closer as it grew out of the water into a flowing, half-absent figure. The way it bobbed and grew on the wind made her shudder and squeal. There was pain beneath her bones and skin, like her body was coming apart in an effort to run. Eventually, the phantom was standing directly over her like an animal on its hind legs, dwarfing out the blue sky and glowing world around her. Then Marjorie awoke. She'd peed herself. She could feel the warmth down her inner thighs to her feet. The blankets were heavy and wet below and above her legs. It had been years since something like this had happened. She panicked and quickly thrashed to get the sheet off of her. There was a slapping sound as her heel hit something directly behind her. She froze at first. Her body couldn't communicate with her brain. She simply concentrated on breathing. Marjorie had been sleeping on her side as always. She hadn't even noticed someone else was in bed beside her. It was a human shape, also turned on its side, like it understood where it should be positioned in the bed. In the gloom of distant moonlight and morning darkness, she couldn't discern many details. Its skin appeared black and hanging, with bits of white weaved through it. It was wearing something too, some sort of pajamas that seemed familiar to her. There was a smell in the air. It was the same sourness that drifted through the house. She had tried to scour, scrub, wash, and wipe it away countless times with a whole shelf full of chemicals. Marjorie screamed and rolled out of bed. She scuttled back into a shelf, knocking photos and books down. A raspy voice rose up from the thing. It sounded stretched, barely there, like it was trying to make itself work, but only solitary emptiness powered its vocal cords. "Hello, honey," the voice said. The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Owen Swerkstrom, and Robert Don. The survey was written by Owen Swerkstrom. Lost Contact by Robert Dawn, and A Rose for Walter by Patrick W. Marsh. The voice of Hidden Oaks performed by Robert Dawn. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Produced by Robert Dawn, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. You can find out more online by visiting us at hiddenoakspodcast.com or by finding us on Twitter at Hidden Oaks Pod and Instagram at Hidden Oaks Podcast. You can find more David Schwartz at dtschwartz.com. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production. Thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time.